Lion Boy, Chapter 11. It was mid-afternoon when the great crimson ship came through the electricity farm, ranks of ocean windmills like an army of giant propellers on sticks, into the harbour at Le Havre. Charlie found that he was very glad to see it land again, although he hardly noticed missing it. As soon as they were docked, he ran down the gangplank onto the great big concrete quay, desperate to find a cat with some news. As he landed, his legs jarred horribly. How very solid the ground seemed after his days at sea. "Hey there, Lion Boy," called a voice from the deck behind him. It was Major Tibb. "You all better get right back on board right now. We don't do shore leave without any leave. Get back in here and help Macomo. There's plenty of work to be done." Turning back disappointed into the ship, Charlie saw a most peculiar sight. A great crane had been waiting for them on the quay when they cruised in, looming red and white against the sky. It had now sort of leaned in towards the ship, where the entire crew seemed to be scurrying around on deck at the foot of one of the masts. A huge chain hung from the crane and was, Charlie realised, being attached near the base of the mast. Another chain hung in mid-air. No, it was moving. Halfway up the mast, another knot of sailors were busying themselves with something. Suddenly, a cry went up. The sailors all stood back and down as if in a single movement, and the mast was uprooted like a great tree in a high wind, or a giant weed in the hand of a giant gardener. Where it stood tall and proud, it now lay flat in the air, hanging from the chains, flying slowly and ponderously towards the quay. "What's happening?" cried Charlie to one of the harbour guys standing by him on the quay. "Stand back!" shouted the man as the mast lurched through the air in their direction. "Way back! Stand back!" Charlie goggled. Then, as soon as the mast was laid down, unlikely to knock anyone's head off, he scampered back up the gangplank onto the deck. "What's going on?" he asked one of the sailors. "Unstepping the mast," replied the sailor briefly. He was on his way to the base of the second mast. "Didn't think those that'd fit under the bridges of the Seine, did you? Well, we'll leave them here in storage. Pick up the other set at Port St. Louis. Get over now, because I'm busy." Charlie gazed in amazement as a second and then the third mast was lifted from their roots, flown through the air and put down onto the quay. Or he would have, but Macomo was shouting him, wanting him to go to the bursar and remind him that they'd been promised extra fresh meat for the lions, but hadn't had any money yet, and telling him to make sure that the quartermaster had arranged for the meat to arrive before dawn the next morning. It was an early start, and it was going to be a long run down to Rowan, and when he'd done that, he needed to run ashore and get some of Macomo's black cigarette papers, because he was running out. Charlie was happy as he could to go ashore. The quay was frantic with activity. Fresh bread and vegetables were coming aboard. Sailors were refilling the water tanks in the hold through massive hose pipes like a giant python, which flexed and leapt as the water poured through. He found a tobacco, which was a smallish shop selling all kinds of smoking things, a street in from the harbour, and found his French was quite good enough to buy Macomo's horrible little papers. All the while he had an eye open for a cat, but nothing. He took a roundabout route back to the quay, but no luck. Where were they all? Surely a harbour should be full of cats. He could delay no longer. Macomo would yell at him if he was late, and Charlie needed to keep him sweet. Behind a packing case full of sardines, though Charlie didn't know it, Claudine, a very fat little pink-nosed French cat, laid fast asleep with a scrap of paper under her paw. Claudine had accepted half of the marmalade's cat dinner on top of her own dinner, in exchange for agreeing to deliver the note to the brown English boy on the crimson ship. She had eaten so much that she had dozed off. The marmalade cat, having seen his human friends transferred at the dead of the night onto the sleek little motorboat, was already heading back to England, happy to know that the letter was on its way. Claudine was very lazy. Having been up late with the marmalade cat, she slept all day. That evening, as the mad activity of restocking a boat with so many people and animals on board began to wind down, Charlie joined Macomo in the dining room and drank hot chocolate with him, being friendly and listening to tales of the lion trainers of old. He especially went to Major Tibb and thanked him for taking him on board and giving him the job of lion boy. He chatted with the twins, with Hans and Julius, and some of the Italians, who after supper sang and played the mandolin, and everyone joined him. Later, he curled up the rope locker. All the while he thought and thought about what would be the best way to achieve the job with which the lion had charged him. All the while, Claudine slept on. Just before dawn, the engine started to shudder and rumble, and the tide turned that would carry the Circe up the great broad, gleaming sign to Paris. Charlie smelt the bacon frying in the galley and heard the gulls cawing in the pale first night. With cries and calls and a great churning of water, Circe pulled into the river. Behind them, a fat little cat rushed into the waterside. Seeing the great ship move inexplorable river, a look of great guilt and sadness appeared on her face, and she started to cry. Beside her, a scrawny, mouldy-looking black dockyard cat with bald patches on its bottom and sharp blue eyes told her rudely to stop her yowling. "Don't you talk to me," she said prissily. "The likes of you should not talk to the likes of me." "Well, the likes of you shouldn't be screeching the whole place down," said the rude cat. "Why don't you just go back to your palace, Madame de Precious?" Whereupon she stopped yowling and started snivelling instead. Told him at great length, with lots of repetition, that she had every right to be there, which was more than could be said for someone by rights shouldn't exist at all. She promised to get a message to the boy with the missing parents, and he was sailing away on that boat right there. And if he'd done such a thing, he too would be yowling and screeching the place down. And she was so upset about it that she didn't know what she'd do. The mouldy-looking cat screeched. "It'll be them," he explained. "It'll be that boy. We've got to get to the epistle at once. You flaming dingwit, how stupid can you get? Gimme that." Once he got the letter, he was no longer interested in her. He looked after the ship, estimated her speed, looked around at the early morning traffic, and raced straight to the bus terminus. With a letter in his teeth, speared onto one of his canines, he leapt onto the roof rack of the first electrobus heading south. He sat and complained, without ceasing, to the other cats up there about how incompetent the French were. His French was, he was a north of an England cat on his travels, but at least he made an effort to be rude to them in their own language. Charlie, with no knowledge of any of this, had decided what he had to do. When Macomo fed the lions that morning, Charlie watched closely, without being observed, what he did with the medicine. 5 drops in the oldest lion's water, 3 for each of the mothers, 1 for Elsina, and 5 for the young lion. He watched closely where Macomo put the medicine. It was in a small locker in the lion cabin, and he watched closely where Macomo put the key of that small locker. Then, when after lunch, Macomo laid down with his crimson cloak around him to smoke his cigarette and have a doze, Charlie silently tiptoed into the cabin. Once he was certain that Macomo slept, quietly and with great fear in his heart, Charlie took Macomo's own water flask from where it stood on the floor beside him. He emptied it out and refilled it with the oldest lion's water bottle, the bottle with the most medicine which had been added. He replaced the bottle by the lion trainer's side, and then he tipped out the rest of the medicined water into the lion's bottles. The low gurgling sound as the water poured out made Charlie start, but Macomo didn't stir. Most of it went onto the floor. It just couldn't be helped. He just hoped that Macomo wouldn't notice, and he might well not, because it was Charlie who cleaned the lions' cages anyway. Swiftly and silently, he refilled the lions' drinking bottles with fresh, clean water. All the while, the young lion and Elsina watched him, and they purred quietly. Elsina growled gentle phrases of encouragement. Then they all just had to wait and see what happened. Charlie lay back on his bale of hay and despite everything, began to doze a little himself. It wasn't too long before Macomo woke up, thirsty, reached to his flask and took a long swig. So far so good. Disturbed by the noise, the oldest lion woke up. He was also thirsty and took a long swig of his own water. Neither of them seemed to notice any difference. Julius had said they would be stopping each night and expecting to reach Paris in 6 days' time. That meant there were 6 more opportunities to make and keep Macomo dopey, and 6 more days to clear the mind of the oldest lion and bring his spirit back. If Charlie could pull off this trick again and again, and if the young lion had been right about what was in the medicine, then by the time they reached Paris, the oldest lion would have his spirit back, and Macomo would be constantly tired, sleepy, dull and dispirited. Charlie grinned at the young lion. The young lion whisked his whiskers at Charlie. Step 1 had been accomplished. Macomo yawned, rolled over in his cloak and went back to sleep. "Yay," whispered Charlie in triumph, but trying to be very quiet. Macomo began to snore gently. Charlie and the younger lions began to relax. The lionesses looked on silently. "Charlie," said Alcina, "why were your parents taken away? Have they been taken to a circus like us?" "Don't be daft," the young lion began. "Humans join circuses because they want to, not because anyone makes them." "But in a way it's the same," Charlie said. "Someone wants them to work for them, perform tricks that they don't want to perform, to hand over their specialness and their skills." Alcina looked shocked. The lionesses blinked. They understood this, and they felt for Charlie. Charlie didn't notice. He just thought of something. "Ah," he sighed. The young lion cocked its ear. "I know what it is," said Charlie. "At least, I don't know what it is, but I know..." And then he stopped himself from telling the lions. He'd twice let his mouth run away with him, giving his name to Major Tib and ringing Raffy to be rude and proud. He very much wanted a friend to confide in him, but it was too dangerous. Only if he needed to would he tell the lines about the series of letters and numbers which was written in his mother's blood. It wasn't that he didn't trust them, he just had to be self-controlled about this. "If you know," said the lion, "might they not come after you too?" Charlie felt cold. Could Raffy know that he had the formula? Could Raffy know what it was for? No, surely not. But Charlie knew so little about what was going on. And if Raffy knew, maybe he'd think it was easier to get it out of Charlie than out of his parents. But why would Raffy want it? He's just No, Charlie, he's not just an anything. He's in this up to his ears. Probably thinks he can sell it or something. He's your enemy. Raffy hadn't rung again since the young lion had roared at him, so in that sense the roaring had worked. But Charlie really had to keep his head down. The circus was a good place to hide, and he should never have risked it by making that telephone call. "You need to talk to a cat," said the young lion. "Find someone coming the other way and see what's been said." "I can't go and start yelling in cat over the side of the ship to some passerby," said Charlie. "The circus guys and the sailors will think I'm crazy." True," said the young lion. "Wait till we pull in for the night at Rouen, and then you can go and have a sniff around." Charlie nodded and went back to his rope locker. He wanted to try the telephones again, just to see if by some miracle somebody had called him, but he didn't. Just in case Raffy had. Fancy slimy git, he muttered, but it just didn't work. He felt so alone. My only friends are lions, he thought, trying the idea on for size and quite liking it, but also finding it quite scary. He wondered if he could confide in Julius or Hans. He'd like to. Nothing against the lions, but sometimes a boy just wants to talk to another boy, but he just couldn't risk that. Everyone was banned from both the big top and the rehearsal cabins when anyone else was rehearsing, so he hadn't seen anybody's act yet, and he longed to. Hans Kitten apparently did a parachute jump. Whatever plan developed for the lion's escape, Charlie decided it would happen after the big show in Paris. He might never again have the opportunity to run away with a circus, and he absolutely insisted that he was going to get to see the show at least. Of course, what he really wanted was to be in it, flying through the air on the trapeze, top mounter in the Lacidi family human pyramid, or even the human cannonball. He would be in a little velvet suit, landing way over yonder, with his face covered in smuts and his ears ringing. He wanted to see the learnt pig being learnt, and he wanted to see Madame Barbu. Did she just walk in, or be beard? Or did she have tricks too? Did she do tricks with a beard? Julius and Hans and the twins had made it clear that there was a big difference between acts. People with skills who did amazing things and belonged to the circus, and what they called freaks, people who just sat there looking weird or strange, like a three-legged calf or the fattest person in the world. If a freaky-looking person had an act, then that was great. They could and they should be with a circus. But not if they were just there for people to stare at. It's easy to feel alone and weird when people are just staring at you, said the twins in unison. But if you're doing something to amuse and amaze them, then that makes you feel good. There was so much that he wanted to see. He wanted to watch the audience's face when the ring cage came down, and he scurried from one hole to another, pegging it safely into place so the lions couldn't escape. He wanted to hear the whistling and the droning around the plains and through the streets of Paris, so all the Parisians would be saying, "What's that?" widening their eyes and dropping their shopping bags. For a moment, Charlie seriously thought that perhaps he should not help the lions to escape after all. Then he thought about his parents. He thought about the ruined cats, and about Raffy and the sneaky mother, and about the lions lying about in the African sun, being free and being happy, and then he sighed. It's 376 kilometres from Le Havre to Paris. They would be passing through 6 locks, and the journey would take 6 days. It could be done quicker, but because the Circe was so huge, she had to move quite slowly once they were past Rouen. If they went too fast, their wake would capsize smaller vessels or wash away the banks of the river. There were speed limits to respect, and the locks took time to pass through. But this first section of the journey had to be done as fast as possible. They had actually set off just before the tide had turned, because there was a low bridge at Honfleur, and they had to get there for the low tide so the ship could actually pass under it. "We're on the road to Rouen," cried Julius, giggling. "There's no hope for us now." "What?" said Macomo, who didn't have any sense of humour. "Rouen," said Hans. "You know, like ruin, the road to ruin." Macomo still didn't get it, or if he did, then he didn't think much of it. They soon left the open bleakness of the estuary behind and were moving quickly past pretty wooded cliffs that gave way to swampy-looking sandbanks. Stuck on one of them, a little way ahead, Charlie and Julius could see a small boat stuck at a strange angle. It looked as if it had been washed up there and just left hanging. There were some people on it shouting and waving. They could just make them out. "Oh, hang on," said Julius. "This should be good." "What?" said Charlie. As he said it, he felt a strong, firm increase in the rumble of the Circe's engines. He felt a strong, forceful surge in her power, and they were speeding up. It was a bit like a moment before an aeroplane takes off, though of course Julius and Charlie had never been in an aeroplane. It was a moment of pure power, and it thrilled the boys. "What's happening?" yelled Charlie. "We're going to drown that boat." "Quite the opposite," cried Julius, grinning and hanging over the side. "Look, look!" The people in the boat had stopped waving. As the Circe drew nearer, Charlie could see that they were very busy. They were up on deck, facing the shore, and they had poles and boat hooks. A couple of people were on shore too, also holding poles out as if they were expecting something. And so they were. As the Circe came careening back, she steered dramatically in towards the bank. Charlie thought she was going to collide. "What are they doing?" he yelled. But then, rather later than Charlie found comfortable, the Circe swerved suddenly back into the middle of the river. The great wave of her wake spread in a huge V shape behind her, whooshing towards the bank and the little boat that hung so precariously upon it. "Alley-oop!" came a shout from the Lasidi family, who were hanging from the rails like Julius and Charlie, watching the action. Charlie was terrified for the little boat, but as the wash came upon it, a cry went up aboard and ashore, and there was suddenly a great pushing and shoving with the poles and boat hooks, as those ashore tried to push the boat into the river, and those aboard tried to push off from the river bank. With the arrival of all the extra water underneath them, it worked. The Circe's wake had snatched the little ship from the muddy sandbank where she had been stranded, and pulled her back into the main flow of the river, right way up, shaking, and its occupants cheering. "Wow!" cheered Charlie. "Aye, aye, aye, aye!" cried the Lasidi family. "Caramba!" yelled Julius. The circus ship gradually slowed down again. Capsizing the little boat she'd just rescued was not part of this plan. "How often do you do that?" asked Charlie. "Hardly ever," said Julius. "I've heard of it, but I've only seen it done once before, by another ship, and it didn't work." The little boat got shoved even further up the bank, and on its side too. That was fantastic. Fantastic. Charlie and Julius careened about the deck, pretending to be small boats stuck on mud flats, and being big boats rescuing them, until Julius suddenly found that he was stuck in a mud flat, a big pile of learnt pig's poo. Charlie got the giggles. Julius, however, was cross. He felt Hans ought to be more careful where his pig pooed, and that went and jumped on him, which made Hans cross. He felt Julius had jumped on him and walloped him when he had even known that his pig had pooed. Charlie left them to it and went quietly back on deck to think about the lions. That night, when Macomo had gone to dinner, Charlie said to the young lion, "What I don't understand is why you not affected by the medicine. It was in your water too, but you're not dopey and tired, and you haven't given up." "He's been sharing my water," said Elsina quietly. "I get fewer drops because Macomo is hoping I will have cubs one day, and the drops are bad for a young lioness's health. So I just get one drop to calm me down a little. Of course, one drop had hardly any effect on him because he's much bigger than me." He gestured to the young lion, who smiled and looked rather pleased with himself. Charlie nodded. He was glad that these creatures he had fallen in with were so intelligent. This was reassuring. Later, just as Charlie was preparing to sneak ashore and find a cat, Macomo said, "Don't imagine that you are going ashore. Tonight you can sleep here and guard the lions. Do not leave them alone. French people are not honest." Charlie was torn between anger at not being able to go ashore to find a cat and get some news, and wanting to say, "That is just stupid. You can't say somebody isn't honest just because of where they're from. Some are and some aren't, like everybody." He couldn't do either, so he just sat there, fuming in his line cabin. He made himself crosser still by ringing his dad's phone over and over, even though it had now been unobtainable for days. He was furious that he had to do as Macomo said. To avoid making him suspicious, he had to be sensible and keep out of trouble. If it hadn't been for that, he would have been over the side in a second, no matter what the old bigot had said. He was getting desperate now for news. It didn't feel like being sensible. It felt like running. It felt like punching someone, throwing something out of the window. He looked at his phone. He looked up, fancy slimy git. Before he could stop himself, he pressed the button, message service. "Hi, Raffy," he said in an insolent way. "Hope my trip to the zoo amused you, and what a shame it is that you haven't called again. I'd be so interested to learn how you sleep at night." And then he hung up quickly, because in his mind the sentence was continuing. "You greasy bullet slime ball." And his purpose was not to make Raffy angry again. It was there to put him off the scent. There, done it. Charlie smiled dangerously. It worked for about 5 minutes. The zoo, thought Raffy, gliding along in his silver car. Which zoo, I wonder? And why? And then he thought, and why wouldn't he be telling me, ringing me specially to tell me that he'd been on a trip to the zoo? Because he hasn't. Here for the moment, Raffy took a wrong turning. He wants me to think it was just a trip. He's at a zoo now. He's staying in a zoo. And so his research villain called, and as a result, wasted another couple of days and quite a lot of money having him locate and visit all the zoos in the country, which was reachable by the waterway. And that's the end of chapter 11.